There we go.
Good. All right. We like knowing.
We are back.
Informed.
Back into things. We had a week off.
Wow. What a week! What a week you had.
Yeah, we were out
That's right.
doing some PhD stuff and traveling and
Right.
whatever. And then we're also back on Facebook Live.
Facebook Live.
We've been doing on Periscope Live lately. For anyone who's
And
not live.
I just got here. We are live.
Let me see.
According to Facebook, we are live.
It's even on there. It must be true.
It must be.
It's on Facebook. It must be true.
Oh, that's right.
Well, and we're on Facebook. Therefore, we must be true.
Oh, wow, there we are.
That's pretty much how it works.
There we are.
There we are. Look at that.
So we'll see how it goes. I've had some
Right.
great engagement the last couple of weeks. So lots of wild things happening. And
Oh, you had a lot of wild things happening last week?
well, no, just in the world.
Oh, in
like
the world.
with Kavanaugh stuff and just
Who is it?
crazy times.
Kavanaugh?
Yeah.
Kavanaugh. What's that? What's that about?
Did something
I've
happen?
been living in a cave. What is it? But before we do Kavanaugh,
Living in the cave?
I want to have a fun story
Oh, good. All right.
because this is a funny story. Because Ward likes to start us with a funny story.
There it is.
So I have it.
Good. All right.
All right. So here it is. The title: University of Manchester Students' Union bans clapping. See, you're already laughing.
Well,
I thought this was like my Hollywood and witchcraft fun story. From
No, this is fun. This is funny.
Oh my god.
So,
remember that?
Yes, I do. That was like our first
Come
episode.
on, that was like funny.
No one even knew what you were talking
That
about.
was funny.
Go back to episode 1. Lawyer brings up a terrible story that nobody knew what he's talking about. He thought it was funny. We didn't laugh.
It was totally funny.
Yeah,
It still remains
All
funny.
right.
the jury's still out on
For
that
the
one.
group of three of you, it was funny.
Me,
Let's just-
myself, and
Let's
I.
call it a hung jury. You know, if we can't decide, we can't agree. So it says here, the student union has ditched clapping, whooping, and cheering. No, don't do that.
And whooping and cheering. Oh.
In favor of jazz hands. The sign language for clap. You know, there's it. Reps of the University of Manchester voted to replace noisy appreciation for the British Sign Language equivalent, a wave of both hands. Union officer Sarah Khan said traditional clapping can cause issues for students with autism, sensory issues, or deafness.
Oh my gosh.
But I don't know how it causes them if they're deaf, but
Yeah.
but the move was criticized by some. So
That hurt my
here's the big thing. Miss Khan, the union's libertarian and access officer, who proposed the motion at a meeting, said clapping can discourage some from attending democratic events. She called jazz hands, so-called jazz hands, she said, encouraged an environment of respect. I think a lot of times, she says, even in parliamentary debates, I've seen their clapping, whooping, talking over each other, loud noises encourages an atmosphere that is not as respectful as it could be. So basically, she's worried about people being triggered and angered by
People are
applause.
so totalitarian.
Banned applause. I just thought that was funny. I don't really have any serious comments at all.
It's just insane.
Oh my god.
I know, but you have to. So that's why you have to laugh, because I think
It's
you'll go nuts
insane.
if you don't just laugh.
I mean, who sits around and thinks that clapping is bad? Who does this?
Well, I think there's people who are looking for. I want to make a mark on life. I need a purpose. I don't have a
So
purpose.
I'm going to ruin clapping for everyone.
I'm going to do something. I'm going to leave my mark on life, and it's going to be significant, and the world will know.
You know, I've talked a lot about stats recently, and I've always said that the only true stat, and I'm going to modify this because now I think that there is another stat that's true. The only true stat that is incontrovertible through time immemorial is that on average, 1 out of every 1 person dies.
Okay, all right.
That's true historically.
Right.
Think about, because it's an average, because
It is.
Old Testament, Elijah
Yeah.
got taken up on a wall and he never died.
Right.
But Lazarus, like in the
Neither
New
did
Testament, he
Enoch.
died. Jesus raised him, and then he
Enoch.
died again.
Right.
So if you average it out over the billions of people that ever existed, statistically, it's
Or
pretty much
Jesus
incontrovertible.
died.
He died, rose,
Enoch,
but he's only died once.
But he
Enoch walked with God, and then he was not.
Yeah,
That's right.
But
Well,
then
he
he
didn't
raised
die.
the little girl in the New Testament, Jesus, the little girl who died.
That's
So
right.
there again, it averages it all out.
Actually,
So-
no. And then there's the widow of Nain's son who was raised.
Don't try to find.
No,
an
I'm
incontrovertible
And
stat.
Paul.
And Paul, and
The guy who fell out of the window.
Eutychus,
Right,
that's
exactly.
Eutychus.
So
I think we're winning
See,
here.
they died. No, but see,
We're winning.
they died.
We are
Yeah,
winning.
They rose, but then they died again.
Right,
It still
exactly.
averages out.
They do. But some people
Still
died
average.
more than once.
That's I know, but it
So-
still averages.
You'll die like 1.00001 times.
That's what I said. On average, 1 out of every one. I didn't say average. I said on average.
Right.
Whatever.
That's
See?
right.
On average, I
See?
got you.
See, now you're with me.
On average, I got you.
On average,
Measured over the billions of people that ever
Yes,
lived,
right.
on average.
On average.
Typically.
one out of every one
Typically.
person's size.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
But you
That's
can't
true.
say for certain.
But I'm adding that. I'm modifying that today.
You can't say for
Okay.
certain.
So now I forgot what I was going to modify with you guys.
We're
doing
gonna
so
hassle
much,
you too much.
so much hassle on that.
I'm sorry. Oh,
Now I remembered. I was offended by your clapping, and it reminded me.
Here it is. Here
This
it
is true,
yeah.
and I don't think I need an average for this.
All right.
This is true for everybody. 100% of the people who have ever lived will offend somebody at some point. Something you do will offend somebody,
Yes, that's true.
and there is nothing you can do to
No,
prevent
that is
someone from being offended.
that is true.
Well,
I'm pretty sure that's not even an average. I
I
think that is a hard
I think that's a
stat.
hard statistic, yeah.
And nothing
I
you do
will
will
say
offend.
technically I disagree, but that's okay.
Oh,
I see
I'm
your
offended
point.
at your disagreement.
I have-
See, you're wrong.
Someone who loses a child in the womb is not necessarily offended.
No, I didn't say everything you do will be offensive. I said something. Everybody will do something.
I don't
that
know
offends
what
somebody.
that person does that's offensive. But I understand your point. People who are cognitive, have conversations,
Right.
Yeah.
be offended. You'd be
Well,
offended
I mean,
by
if
something.
clapping offends somebody,
Oh my
then you're
gosh.
offended.
Oh, it just...
If some people are offended
Oh.
that you
I
say
just-
hi instead of hello.
It's just really...
You'll
it's
do
just
something in life
Yeah.
to offend
You-
somebody. is the
absolutely.
point.
It's just
Exactly.
really
Yes.
different in America.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead. No.
I was going to say,
You're offending me.
Jesus, good. If Jesus, woo! If Jesus,
I'm happy.
God himself on earth was offended people,
Yes.
you're not going to get away with not offending people.
People were offended by Jesus himself. He
Even
was
by God.
sinless.
Exactly. It's, he did everything pretty
He
well.
did everything
Yeah.
right.
On average.
On average, he did
Jesus.
pretty darn well.
And he did everything right, and he offended people.
Right.
Exactly.
Correct.
You know,
And
So that's all I'm saying.
it's all downhill for
It's
us.
all
from
So
downhill.
there.
if the goal is a perfect environment where no
Right.
one you'll never get anything done because you'll have to live in little bubbles, but then somebody will be offended that your bubble is different than their bubble. And
And you know what's really interesting?
Anyway.
That
Yes.
actually speaks to the fact that why we need to live out our consciences to the best that we can, because there's always someone who's going to be offended. There's just always. I mean, you could say the sky is blue, and someone is going to be offended. And you can't live. I used to tell my football players, man, you got to have big elbows. You cannot live in the world without elbows. You need space.
my wife hits her elbows on everything. I don't know if that relates to your analogy.
No, but
She bumps
the
into stuff,
analogy
I don't-
is that you got to be able to take up space, and people, you
Your
need to
wife
have
has
your
big
own
elbows?
space.
I think that's what he's saying.
So she's not offended.
She's not offended. But what happens, particularly like the lady with the jazz hands things, people just want to use the things that offend them to take away your freedoms.
Yeah, I mean, I will give them the benefit of the doubt in this. I think from her worldview, she thinks she's making the world a better place. I don't think she is. But I think that for many people, there's a genuine sense of like,
There is-
I'm trying to be inclusive. I think that
Right.
intent is genuine. I just think that she's been sold bill of goods of how to
Yeah.
be inclusive of people by controlling other people and all those things. I think that's where it goes wrong. But I think the motivation, I think we could all agree, is good. I mean, to make sure environments we create, whether it's in our classroom.
when you mentioned the autistic people, for
Yeah,
instance,
yeah,
or
for
whatever, people that
example,
can be overloaded by their
Sensory.
sensory
Right.
overload and stuff like that. I don't know that they're offended. I think they're bothered. Might be a different.
Yeah, well, that's an actual, neurological. Yeah,
But there's a neuro.
they have an
it's like,
actual physiological response that
Right.
they cannot control. That's not just something like.
I do
Exactly.
think
Like that's not something like
But
when
let me
I'm in a
ask you a
game
question.
on my basketball, watching my kid playing basketball, and the other team is like winning big, and they're like, they go down and score again. Like when this team,
You don't jump up and cheer.
They're up there, yeah. It's like, dude, that's just offensive. So that's
Right.
annoying.
That-
But see-
that
but
is-
see, here's
that's
That's different than
right.
autism.
Right, but
response.
here's
Exactly
here's
right.
here's the thing though.
Yeah.
I think this is where the issue is. People need to be free to be obnoxious, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that everybody has to be, but they need to be free to be obnoxious. I mean,
Are you looking for freedom?
no,
Is it- are you-
well,
Yeah.
I'm really bothered by this notion that that everybody needs to be nice. Everybody isn't going to be nice. I mean, I'm around you two all the time, but I'm just saying.
So we know you're not nice. That's
Right.
what you're saying. Yeah, thank you.
But everybody doesn't need to be nice. I mean,
Turn that around.
I
That's nice.
see that. Everybody doesn't need to be nice, and everybody
Wasn't
doesn't
nice.
need to be
I liked it.
genteel.
Well,
and
everyone's not going to be.
And
everybody's
not going to be.
From a Christian perspective, no. But from
I
know what you're saying. Corrective. Leroy is not advocating being unkind. You're saying, look, everyone's not going to be.
Right.
It's just reality.
Right.
It's not a goal. It's just reality.
And think about it. If it was forced on everyone all the time, when would we ever appreciate the genuine
that's
kindness?
what China's going for.
Well, that's the difference between
have cameras everywhere.
Yeah, social control. Yeah. The thing is, how do we resolve that?
Right.
So social control says we do it by positive or negative reinforcement through peer pressures. So if somebody comes in, he's super arrogant or rude, and there's a room of 50 people, and we all turn and look and say, dude, that's not acceptable. He'll either learn or he won't associate with that group of people.
Exactly.
I don't need a law to say, oh, you're going to go to jail for this.
That's exactly right.
That's the problem that's confusing the story. She's right. Environments need to be accommodating and respectful.
To the extent
that
people
do that by
want
social control.
Right.
So if we know that there's somebody in the audience that maybe suffers from autism, we don't need a law that says we ban clapping. We say, hey, I want to make a motion. Today we have a group with us, or somebody here is in our midst. One of our fellow students has a thing. Can we all be respectful of that? And you do it through social.
Because what you're saying is because we care about and we respect that individual.
Exactly.
We moderate our own.
Exactly.
Our
people might complain that you're drawing attention to that person, make them feel bad.
Yeah, but you try it.
But the point is valid depending on how we go about it. But you do it by.
Yeah, there could be a way to do it by
we care for other people, so let's modify this time.
Exactly.
And make some changes out of love and respect.
Let me tell you why I'm so hot about this. I worked at a church, and that church shall remain nameless. But boy, these some of the folks in that church, they made a rule for everything.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we were just being constricted by rules and people being offended. I mean, I don't even want to say people's names, but goodness gracious, we made a rule for how many times? I mean, why do you have to put forks in a specific way? I mean, it was insane, and they just couldn't see how the rules that they were constructing an edifice that just kept people everywhere in chains.
We have a term for that in Christianity. It's called legalism.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
And this is legalized legalism.
Yes.
In outside the bounds of the church. So this is confining and stifling,
the
relationally stifling.
The law needs to solve every problem is not necessarily the right way to do so.
There
is a place for the law.
It's looking at the external, and this external laws, external rules do not change the heart.
Yes.
And which is what Christ came to change.
We talked about that case earlier where, are you going to talk about the case where the boy was...
No, I wasn't going to get into that one.
Okay, we don't have to...
Let's do this. Let me transition to this because this is where because this gets into the time. I know we don't always plan our topics, but this is something that's been going on with the Kavanaugh hearings and the accusations and due process and all those things that come up. And this is a case where the law does matter. Here's what the law is good at in the sense of being evaluating and giving everyone their right to due process. So, I mean, everybody kind of kept track of it, but the quick summary is obviously everyone know that Judge Kavanaugh was nominated by Trump to be on the Supreme Court. Far into the process, after he'd already been sort of like it was at its end, the Democrats leaked the letter from a woman who wanted to remain anonymous,
Dr. Ford,
and leaked it to the public that she had, she said that when they were 17, 18, well, he was 17, 18, she was 15, 16, she doesn't remember the year, but anyway, he had sexually assaulted her in some fashion. Right. And despite the fact that she wanted to remain anonymous and just have it sort of investigated, it was leaked to, just create chaos. Mm-hmm. And since then, of course, everybody is like, I believe the woman, and there's chants and there's protests and stuff. And so the argument has been, well, do you believe her just because she's a woman? And, I got into a discussion. This is where stats comes into this. Somebody said, well, less than anywhere from 2 to 8% of cases do women lie. That's the stat this person used.
2 to 8%.
Yeah, that's what they use. And I don't know if that's the valid stat or not. I didn't even argue about the stat. I said, well, it really doesn't matter what the percentage of this of false cases or not. The question is each case has its own merits, and that's how we have to weigh truth. And that's why we need due process. And so the problem has been that everybody, when we talk about due process, the people opposed to that are saying that that's being used to silence women. That's how it's been sort of framed. Mm-hmm. The due process is just the way of the oppressive class of people to silence the woman's voice from speaking up. And so what I wanted to look at was a couple examples of why due process matters. Because, see, we see all within our limited scope. You know, the elections don't turn out the way we want, so we say eliminate the electoral college. You know, because it's convenient now for my side of my argument. But the problem is due process it has been around, and it's been abused in many other cases too. And so I wanted to give a couple quotes to get you guys to think. And I know Leroy, we've talked about similar stories. This is actually a book by James Cone. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him. He's a black liberation theology guy.
He's the guy who actually is the founder of it in the black church, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, he's the modern...
Yeah, you've
the
talked
guy,
about him before.
Yeah. You know, he built on some others up, obviously going back to the early 1900s.
Guillermo Gutierrez.
Yeah, I mean, there's
where he got it from, right?
Yeah, so, but he's really the guy that pioneered it in the sense of applying liberation theology specifically to American black circumstance.
He just passed away last year.
Yeah, he just passed away last year. And while I don't necessarily agree with many of his things, I think, I won't get into why I disagree because it just distracts us. But he makes some points in his book. He's talking about this. Now, see if this sounds familiar. Different context, but it's still an argument about due process. He basically says in his book, this is from the cross and the lynching tree. Basically, he's making a comparison, the cross of Jesus Christ and the trees that blacks were crucified on, essentially, during the area of crucifixion or lynching when it was very common, and, you know, 5,000-6,000 people were lynched in a very short period of American history, and a lot of it by consent of law, so to speak. Although it wasn't officially okay, it became okay. He said this, though: without slavery, the supremacists, the white supremacists, had to have a means by which they could keep oppressing blacks, because they lost their slave-holding rights, so they had to oppress blacks. So he says, quote, even when sexual relations were consensual, that is between a black woman and a white woman. So in the South, if a black man and a white woman had sex consensually, race mixing, it was called race mixing, or mockingly called mongrelization, was always translated to mean rape. So in other words, a woman could not consent no matter what, because just the fact that it was interracial was considered rape. So, and that idea of the black man who's going to rape you was so enshrined in the Southern culture that any accusation of rape was automatically accepted as true. And the man who accused, the black guy accused, had no due process. He was lynched. Theodore Roosevelt, who bought into the racism of the day, Roosevelt had a lot of problems. Some of the people he hired, his guy who was part of the national science, overall the science nationally, was the guy that had Oda Benga put in as a human, an African pygmy put in the Bronx Zoo on display in the chimpanzee house. So Roosevelt was not your greatest example of civil liberties. Anyway, Roosevelt said, the greatest existing cause of lynching is the perpetration, especially by black men, of the hideous crime of rape, the most abominable in all the categories of crime, even worse than murder. So, see, he valued, he said, hey, women should be raped. Rape is evil. Rape is terrible. But those terrible black men that do it, see, that's why they're getting lynched. If they weren't rapists, they wouldn't be getting lynched, which is his thought. What do you guys thoughts? I mean,
he's
create little scenarios I want to throw out, but just
straight crazy.
That's problematic.
It is problematic.
that's morally problematic. I mean, it's inhumane. It's devaluing. It's self-justifying.
But see, he took what? What is the word we use today? It's the seriousness of the charge.
Right. Exactly.
He said that charge is so serious, we don't even wait for that's why they're lynched, because it's such a serious charge.
Because the charge wouldn't happen if they were innocent.
Yeah.
Right.
Type thing.
Yeah. And if they were innocent, we wouldn't make those charges.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So.
And we know there's cases that it happens. So statistically it happens. So therefore we must judge every case as true. Every accusation must be true because it's more likely than not. That's how they perceived it.
Right.
And that's the danger that we're getting into today. We're just picking a different class of people.
Right now it's a social lynching.
it is very much that case, whether it's on media or not, without due process. And this is why due process is important, because historically, when it's been ignored, it's resulted in death or false imprisonment. In the case in U.S. history, it was blacks. Right. Now it could be white men.
That was their version of social justice warrior. Now we have our version of social justice warrior. But it's the same. It's the same rationale.
Right. Yeah.
Driving both.
We disagree with their moral underpinning.
Right.
And we would agree with the people today that raping or assaulting women is wrong.
Yes.
I would disagree with Roosevelt that just because somebody's black and they have sex with a woman, that makes...
And if they consent. And there's even the consensual issue. Yeah. Even if they consent now and if they come back later and say...
Because the culture deemed it inappropriate.
Right, exactly.
And the thing that's really interesting is people will listen to that scenario that you laid forth with Roosevelt and say, well, we're not those people anymore.
Exactly.
But when you listen to them, the same logic that undergirded that kind of thinking is the same logic that undergirds this. So it's wrong to say that we're not those people. No, we're the same people.
Because the ends do not justify the means.
That's exactly right.
And if you think the end justifies means, you make the argument the argument you just repeated. That's what that is. But you can't, because then when the moral pendulum swings somewhere else, and it's your ox getting gored, it's not a good thing.
Which is the problem with a culture-based morality. When culture-based moralities move, they change. Mm-hmm. Cultures change, and it might not be a black person who's victimized. Now it could be just any male.
Could be a white male being victimized.
Well, and there were tweets and there were Facebook posts about Kavanaugh that says, "I don't care what happened. I'm just glad we ruined his life." And
that was
there have been women.
And one senator said, "It doesn't matter if he's innocent."
Cory Booker.
It doesn't matter if he's innocent. What matter? He's had so many claims brought up against him that basically he needs to.
The seriousness of the charge.
The thing that's very interesting about that is.
So Mike Mendoza.
Hey, Mike's there.
Wants a reference. He came in late.
Oh, we're talking Mike. So that's good for you, Mike, and everyone else. We're reading some little quotes from The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone, which I know you're familiar with. So, but that's what we're reading some quotes from. Sorry about that.
What's very interesting
in relation to Kavanaugh
and
current social justice.
What's very interesting to me is I am keenly interested in due process, in people not going to jail or being charged because of the emotions of someone else. I'm keenly interested in that not happening. And you can look back throughout history and see how that's happened to black men throughout history. And what's fascinating to me is that some black people seem to have forgotten that history and are willing to repeat it upon someone else. And if we're going to do that, then we can't look back at the history of what happened to blacks with any kind of anger and derive any kind of anger or frustration from it, because we're willing to do it to someone else today.
Which is part of the problem, because Cone sort of lionizes to some degree Reinhold Niebuhr in this, because basically what they said is you can never get full justice, you can only get proximate justice. Mm-hmm. So the reality is, yes, it was wrong. He could argue today, well, that was wrong to do it, against blacks, but since now they're in a minority class, it's okay to do it against the group in power.
Right. So
it's partly what some people are arguing.
Yes, and they actually appealed to the wrong back then.
Yes.
As justification for it.
Yes.
We have a word for that.
It's called vengeance.
It's called vengeance.
That's exactly right.
We're appealing to it as a conflict. People who share this worldview are appealing to that as justification. That's exactly right. And that's what people have to be aware of, that there are people that know that it was wrong, what we're talking about was wrong, but they think it's right now because it's considered a minority group out of power,
right, in
case women are considered out of power, doing it to the group in power. Right. Therefore, it's okay to do this because that equalizes power. That's their view on it.
That's the rationale.
It's not moral right wrong. It's equalization of power.
What's fascinating is that the so-called minority, whoever that is, be it women or be it blacks or whomever, technically they're in power. Technically, they're exercising power over another group of people. I mean, this is a never-ending circle.
And actually, Niebuhr acknowledges that. It always would be a cyclical thing where I go in and then you need the more corrective, and where violence could be used to get you into power, but then if it got out of control, the other group could use violence. It's a very dystopian view of
there's a similar story that this happens in the scriptures, believe it or not. Do you remember there's a guy in the Bible named Haman? Remember him?
I've not read my Bible recently.
But remember, Haman wanted to destroy the Jews. And he went to the king, and he said to the king, hey, these Jews are just terrible people. You should let us wipe them out. And the king says, they're against me, go do it.
You're right.
And then he finds out that he's married to Esther, and Esther comes and pleads to him. And the day before that, the king says, well, if you're going to kill him on this day, he gets the Jews to get them the day before that all happens. You see what I'm saying? So they don't want to be killed. So it doesn't, it's a feast of Purim, but they don't kill them all. At least they got all the bad guys before that happened. But the point being, this is not new. This is not a new concept.
Check out this quote, because I think this struck me so much as in our modern context. Changing, we can change the players, but it's the same thing. Cohn writes this, again in The Cross and the Lynching Tree. In their justification of lynching, Southern whites often use the pretext of an alleged, quote, outrage against white women. Lynching, they claimed, was necessary to protect the virtue of white women from the, quote, unspeakable crime of the black male beast, who no longer had slavery in place to keep his bestial behavior in check. Rape, quote, placed him beyond the pale of human sympathy. Think about that. The accusation of rape meant that because he's accused of it, we should have no sympathy for the black man, was how the white supremacists said it. And the world accepted the story that the Negro is a monster which the Southern white man painted him. Now here's the part where I agree with Cohn overall. One thing I disagree with. He makes it as the whites did it under the pretext of alleged outrage, as if it was fake outrage. I don't think it was. I think they were genuinely believed. It was I think it's H.L. Mencken who said, the best way to politics is just scaring the herd into one direction. And I think what happened in the South was that people had their prejudices, but they were scared. The herd got scared by the seriousness of the charge. Oh, rape. Oh my gosh, we're afraid. No, what do we got to do? Oh, well, it doesn't matter. He doesn't. Oh, just kill him, because they were afraid of the black. They were made to fear black people.
There's justification for this. Before we had this, I was reading. For anybody watching, go to Wikipedia and just look up the Scottsboro Boys.
That's always the best source. That's what
but
just in case, it's a good starting point.
But it's really good. Go to Wikipedia and read the Scottsboro Boys. It's a really good piece on them, and there's lines in there where the lawyer for the Scottsboro Boys, these were 9 black Southern boys who were accused of raping 2 white girls on a train, and the Scottsboro Boys case details how their lives were destroyed by these false accusations. But what's amazing was the lawyer for the Scottsboro Boys was a guy named Leibowitz, and he's like, look, you guys are going to try these kids and put them all in jail and give them the death penalty, which most of them got the death penalty. Fortunately, none of them were executed. But he said, you don't have one black juror. And this is why we have to have blacks on the jury today, because of this case, Powell versus Alabama. But what's really interesting was Leibowitz brings in a well-educated black man, and he sits him in the jury box. And he's like, this guy is educated. He speaks well. How come he can't be in the jury pool? And the prosecutor gets up and begins to question him. And the first thing he calls him is by his first name, John. Leibowitz objected and said to call him Mr. The crowd gasped. Like, you threatened to call this guy, you want us to call this guy Mr. The crowd was just like blown away.
To
like
grant him some sort of dignity.
To grant him some sort of dignity.
Right,
So this was the cultural milieu in which these cases happened in the past. It wasn't merely, hostility or anger. It was a deep-seated belief, particularly in the South, that blacks were not equal to whites. That's the undergirding term. There's a great speech by Senator Richard Calhoun. I believe it's Richard Calhoun, who you can read, and he details in this speech why the blacks will never be equal to whites in the South. The whole point being that outrage isn't really what fuels it. It's a deep-seated, particularly in the 1930s where that case took place.
But just to finish that case, though, before you go on. So you were talking about this earlier.
Scottsboro Boys.
So the 2 women that levied the charge of rape against these young men lied.
They did.
And one later confessed
one later
after
confessed.
they were convicted.
Right.
But what the premise of that case was? They're the white women, so they should be believed no matter what.
No matter what.
But they have to be believed no matter what.
Even after they recanted, even after the girl recanted and said it had never happened, they still kept trying these boys until only one boy got. And she wasn't a boy then; he was an adult. He was a grown man. He had a sentence. He was exonerated by George Wallace, of all people.
Oh wow! Yeah,
That's
interesting.
He was exonerated by George Wallace. But think about from 1931.
Yeah, George Wallace he recanted. He recanted of his racism. He apologized, and I think one of King's events, or at least one of the churches that King spoke in. I can't recall.
He did. What's amazing about that is, I mean, from the 1930s.
Then he got elected back into office.
From the 1930s to the 1970s. 1976 is when that happened.
Yeah.
I mean, 40 some odd years.
Yeah.
You're living on the run, having escaped from Alabama.
So in this case, these boys they went to court, but they were still denied due process. Why?
Totally.
Because the seriousness of the charge.
That's right.
And the woman should always be believed. Yeah. And in this case, there was a racial motivation.
So how were they deprived of due process if they went to court?
Because they could give no evidence against
the
women, and because their word, because they were black, meant nothing. And so if you say the man's word means nothing, because he must always be assumed a liar, and the women must always be assumed truthful, without evidence, there's no due process. In this case, this is what I'm hoping people will realize, is that we can agree that this was wrong, because these women who made the accusation, these young girls, were racially motivated by their racial anger. So women can lie about sexual assault.
Right.
That immediately creates cognitive dissonance for the culture. Oh, we always believe. So let's chant that sign. Let me show you this case. Do you still always believe?
And if you're black, knowing history, how could you even as we say back in the hood, how could you even fix your lips to agree with that nonsense? How could you, knowing George Stinney. George Stinney is the youngest person ever executed in America. 14-year-old black boy, 95 pounds, executed, put to death. But because he was accused of killing, I think it was two white girls. He's a little kid, and he was accused of it. No evidence was ever mustered against him, but because he was black, he was the guy. Did
they base the Green Mile off that story?
The Green Mile is based off of George Stinney's case.
They replaced the 95-pound-year-old
with the 300
with a 300-pound, 6'5"
muscle. But
pretty much exactly the story.
But the thing is, and I get it. I get it. I was in a conversation the other day, and there was so many, black women involved in this conversation, and we just didn't agree. But it was very interesting to me how many of them could not continue on with the conversation because they would say something like, "I thought I was over this. I'm not over it." And what I sensed was, what I sensed was, these are people who have been hurt, who, out of their own pain and suffering, are willing, and this will show you why. Man, praise the Lord that when we die, we stand before Jesus. We don't stand for the people who we've sinned against, because some people will never forgive. But in this case, these people who are so hurt by what happened to them, they want justice. And this guy, Kavanaugh, is a scapegoat for
they're feeling justice. Like he is justice for their injustice.
For their injustice, that's exactly right.
And I get the emotive power of that. Yeah. That's very but that's exactly it is a very strong parallel to what we're reading in these stories. These white Southerners felt victimized by the federal government telling them they couldn't do what they want. Now they're completely wrong. They're insane, these racist Southerners. But that's how they, I think that's where Cone misses it. He sort of makes it disingenuous, like they knew better. They knew blacks. I don't think they knew any better. They believed, they were convinced in their worldview that they were the victim. That the white Southerners were the victim, and they were being victimized by these blacks running free and out of control. And the crowds believed that. And they felt, you know what, even if that, because there are cases in Cone's book, he talks about where a guy got off, he wasn't convicted in one case, so they literally went out, found another guy, and hung him in his place.
And killed him, exactly.
And killed him. Yeah. And they knew he was, but they said, hey, but somebody's got to pay. Yeah. Somebody has to pay. Yeah. And that's exactly what the environment we find ourselves in. That's why I said and that's the danger of it. Even though the goal is noble, in this case, for preventing sexual assault against women, you cannot circumvent due process, because when the pendulum swings and the goal is no longer noble,
No, it's just
If you
wicked.
apply that
nobility
same
for one person at the expense of another is not nobility.
you have to recognize the sacred value of each one.
Right.
Kavanaugh has sacred worth. Ford had sacred worth.
It-
Both
this-
deserve to have their stories told
Yes.
and have them heard. And we don't know the truth in the sense of like, I mean, we can evaluate the
We weren't
evidence and
there.
stuff. We weren't there, all that other kind of good stuff. But the point is, so we weigh the evidence.
Mhm.
And so if we say, look, there's no evidence against him, that doesn't mean the man never did it. In any court case, the
Right.
court, that's why the courts declare people
Not
not guilty.
guilty.
They don't declare them innocent,
Right.
except in very rare cases that can actually
Right.
happen. But it's not guilty
Yeah.
because the court cannot ever, rarely, if ever, say with 100% of certainty that they are not guilty,
Right.
or that they are innocent. So they just say not guilty.
Mhm.
And that's where we're confusing. Courts are not the influence of justice. That comes with God in the end. But
Right.
anyway, so you were going to say?
Oh yeah, I forgot. But
I'm sure it was amazing though.
it was revolutionary, and it would bring everyone together. No one would clap. They would only do this, but they would all agree.
Here's the third case I wanted to bring up from this book, and there's several in Cohn's book that I can't even get to, but I think these are just riveting to me in terms of our context. Again, he says, as reported in the Cleveland, Ohio Gazette, January 16th, 1892, a Mrs. J.C. Underwood of Elyria, a minister's wife, falsely raised the accusation of rape against Mr. William Offutt, who she said, so she's white. The accusation is against a black man. Now, I don't know why Cohn is not believing the woman, but and again, I'm not trying to be negative. I'm trying to say that's the context. If we always believe the woman, Cohn as the black man is saying, look, there's a case where we don't, especially when it's driven by racism. Anyway, so she falsely raised the accusation of rape against Mr. William Offutt, who she said forced his way in the house and insulted her, while her husband was stumping the state for the Prohibition Party. And by insulting her, they meant rape. That was just a polite way of saying it. Though the accused vigorously denied her testimony in court and claimed that the sex was not only consensual but occurred at her invitation, his word was dismissed in court. He served 4 years in prison until she confessed to her husband that the relationship was indeed consensual. This is 1892. But the testimony of a black man was not to be believed.
Mm-hmm.
The woman was always right.
Sound like Jews when the woman in a court was not really believed. In the first century. So
understand this motive. She even says this: trying to explain to her husband why she repeatedly had sex with a black man she met at the post office. Mr. Underwood said he had a strange fascination for me, and I invited him to call on me, which he did. Then I sat on his lap, and he made a proposal to me, and I readily consented. Why I did so, I do not know, but that I did is true. He visited me several times after that, and each time I was indiscreet. I did not care the first time. In fact, I could not have resisted and had no desire to resist. Since a neighbor saw the fellow here, so now someone on her behalf has seen this, and I feared I might give birth to a Negro baby, she told her husband, I hope to save my reputation by telling a deliberate lie. Her confession horrified her husband, who had Offutt released from prison and then divorced his wife. Now, that case, the guy got off after 4 years, which is shocking that he still wasn't even, lynched. But still, parallel that story. Every detail in that story could be taken today, change the players and the characters.
Absolutely.
And we see why just the idea that the presumption that the woman is always right and the man is always lying without due process.
But even then, here it was selective, obviously, based on race. Even today, it's selective.
Yes. It's
selective based on if a conservative or a liberal.
Yeah.
Bill Clinton was not given this process, and they bring these things up to some senators even right now who are very guilty of things of beating up their girlfriends or whatever. And there's proof, you have evidence of it, and you can see the beaten up face, pictures of it, and there's no outcry about that from these people. Yeah. It's not just injustice; it's selective injustice against a group that you disagree with.
Our country cannot. I mean, we're not. I mean, I hate to say this, we're not nearly as smart as we were in the 1800s today, or as thoughtful as we were in the 1800s. And we were not all as thoughtful in the 1800s. But what I'm getting at is, today people are just emoting all over the place. They're just emoting, and they're feeling, and they're not thinking of the long-term ramifications of these actions. You cannot have two systems of justice at work. You cannot throw people in jail or deny people opportunity because you hate them. You just can't do it.
Justice can't be based on group classification. It's that intersectionality that we've talked about before. You know, there's classes of people who are considered, you know, the most victimized, less victimized, you know, and who's at the top of that class, or the victim class, has the highest authority to make any claim they want against another person from another class. Therefore, they have to be believed because they're in the highest class of victim. And this is exactly what we had here. It doesn't matter who had political power. As a class, blacks were rejected as having any truth in them.
Right.
As a class, whites were accepted as truth. So the white woman could say anything she wanted. And in this case, even after telling her story. I mean, this guy got off, which is rare. I mean, that was the rare case.
He had to get out of Dodge too, huh?
Yeah. I mean, he did, I'm sure. But but we can't do it by justice can't be based on group classification. It has to be based on individuals and the truthfulness and the veracity of what they have and how we can validate that. That's why due process matters. Even if somebody does something, and as egregious as this sounds, if a guy does assault a woman and she can't produce the evidence in court for that, even if he's guilty, sadly, for those cases, he can't be convicted in court.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that it's any less true that he is evil and she was victim. It doesn't change the truth of that. Right. You know, that's what you have to realize. So Scott.
Yeah, Scott Peterson. He murdered probably at least 2 or 3 of his wives. Right. He was married several times.
Yeah.
And
Well, this is the former cop. Yeah.
Right. The former cop.
Straight crazy guy.
Bad news.
Yeah.
But coming up with the evidence, they finally got him. I don't remember how, but they finally got him.
And they convicted him of killing his second wife.
Right. Yes. But not his first. I don't think. I don't know if there was. Or
he killed someone. He killed his second wife in the bathtub, and he got off because he was a police officer, and they just accepted his word.
Yeah, there was a couple. I mean,
so what happens when you take a class of people and elevate their word above other people?
You don't correct that injustice, and it is an injustice.
Yeah.
You don't correct that by creating more injustice.
Yeah.
More injustice, coming with a false standard of justice or a poor standard, does not make things safer.
Here's where an
make
example
things
is.
better.
You can't always take just because somebody's a cop. Let's put it this way: their word shouldn't always be trusted,
right?
As true just because they're a cop. So, but it always switches. So if a cop is saying, "Yes, this kid did the crime, or that person did this crime," and there's no other evidence to corroborate it,
right?
That person should be found not guilty,
correct? Because
there's no corroborating evidence. Doesn't matter how believable a cop is.
Right.
But the table's true the other way. If somebody accuses a cop of something,
same thing,
and they can't back it up, we can't assume them just because the cop's now the defendant that his word is no good. It's
correct.
Not whether the word is good or not. It's what you can demonstrate in court. But we have to distinguish between what happens in court between true justice. And this is where the Christian worldview has an advantage for these things. Because we know in the end, God's justice is not man's justice.
Right.
Somebody may get away with it now, but God will hold them accountable.
Exactly.
Which is why we don't have to lie.
And we need to be able to take comfort and solace in the fact that even though there'll be injustice in this life, in the next one, everyone will get what is coming to them.
It'll be set right.
It'll be set right. And if we don't have that view, we'll be susceptible to the same taint and the same sickness and illness that the rest of the culture is
part of what they're pursuing is right. They want complete justice. At least I'm going to grant genuineness for some of them.
Sure.
For them. Sure. They want this side of heaven, complete and total justice. It doesn't happen in a fallen, broken world.
And that's the fallacy of Cohn and Niebuhr.
Well, here's where I'll say Cohn is partially right. They're wrong ultimately in their proximate justice because they say it's okay to use violence and power to equalize.
So
power.
they're
all
so does
power
Clinton,
control.
by the way. You just hear what Clinton.
Hillary
Clinton just said. She came out and uncivility doesn't happen until.
It's okay to. It's okay
now
now because we're out of power to use uncivil means. Then we can.
We can moderate our tone once we get off power.
That's neo-Marxism.
Oh, that's just
it's
horrible.
It's great, and it's a great example of it.
Yeah.
But here's where I think Cohen's right. A lot of times, the idea of what we're saying here about God will eventually vindicate justice.
Right.
that was used to pacify blacks into just accepting their status as oppressed.
Oh, that's not good.
And they're right about that was wrong. That's not what we're saying, too, because I want to offer that. Because you guys are saying exactly, if somebody were to read Cone and hear what you were both saying, they'd say, oh, that's the words of oppression that the Southerners use. That is not what that means.
It's not an excuse to avoid justice.
It's not an excuse to accept abuse.
Or to pursue justice now.
But what it is, not to pursue justice.
But what it is, it's an acknowledgement that what we claim to believe about God and that He is sovereign and He will ultimately adjudicate, this means that we really believe that.
Yes.
So literally that statement that they're using is a means to undermine. It's because blacks would, because people who believe in God would rest their hopes in that. But that statement is used to undermine that hope.
Yes.
And to say that you're being Uncle Tom, so to speak, by believing in a sovereign God, that God will ultimately adjudicate these things. You're being an Uncle Tom. You should fight now, in your
we
space
can
now.
resist. We can fight against those things, but not in a violent, non-violent way. But they would say violence is justified because that's the only way to equalize the power. But those aren't the only two choices. Either violence or accept oppression and just be, beat for the rest of your life or raped or whatever. Those aren't the options.
They're not.
There is a middle way.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a false dichotomy. Absolutely.
It is a false dichotomy.
Do you guys remember a guy named Mark? Does this name Mark Tushnet mean anything to you?
No, it's not familiar.
When Hillary was running and they thought that she would win, they thought that she would win and install her Supreme Court justice, right? And this guy named Mark Tushnet, who is a Harvard psychologist, comes out and says that since we've won the culture wars, since we've won them, this is before Hillary gets elected, we need to abandon what he called defensive crouch liberalism. In other words, we need to stop being defensive and now be on the offense because now we've won the culture wars.
Yeah.
So we need to push conservatives into the closet. He literally starts talking about destroying conservatives and saying having no mercy on them because they started these culture wars things.
Yeah. And you see it on the other side too.
Yeah.
The justification of Trump, often his belligerence and meanness is just, well, they deserve it. They
had it coming.
They had it coming. And, is a very pragmatic sort of justification of that sort of thing, which I think is, it's the same. It doesn't matter if it's on your side or not. You can't justify doing wrong because the end goal you believe is right. Mm-hmm. And so that what you're saying happens. It does now. It happens. That's the side. It used to never happen on the Republican side where they would justify that. No. Now saying, well, hey, that's the only way we're going to win. So let's justify this bad behavior because it's in our favor now. And that's very dangerous.
Well,
on either side.
What's happening? Kavanaugh is the touchstone for all of this. Is people are questioning the legal system. They're questioning, the Constitution. They're questioning every aspect of it because a segment of the population is out of power, and because they're out of power, they're using just like it's so interesting that we're talking about this. In the Scottsboro Boys case, if you go back and you read it, you'll find that the people who argued for the Scottsboro Boys were the NAACP, the Socialist American Communist Party.
Yeah, the communists were very strong in the opposition to black oppression, which is why a lot of the liberation theology ended up adopting communist ideals and became neo-Marxist because they had an ally in the communists.
That's exactly
of course,
right.
Communists didn't really care one bit about the blacks.
This was one way of tearing down
the power.
Tearing down the power structures.
Yeah,
exactly right. Yeah. And the same themes are at work today. Just look at the people who are backing the assault against Kavanaugh, whether you like Kavanaugh or not. Just look at the people who are funding the assaults. It's just all insane. It's insane.
Yeah. One last story I think we have time for. This comes out of Cone's chapter. Again, we're looking at the cross and the lynching tree. He had a chapter on sort of like how his black liberation theology had value for feminist equality, for feminism, and where it went. And so he cites some this one gal, her name Mrs. Wells.
Ida B. Wells.
I believe that's her full name. Yeah. I didn't have it in this clip, but I think it's Ida B. Wells. She was wrote under a pseudonym, so no one would know who she was, and she was trying to expose these false accusations of rape against black men. She got this into a paper. It says this: since the rape narrative was most often false, Ms. Wells was determined to tell, as she wrote in a story called "The Truth About the Lynching" in 1892, a truth that few whites wanted to hear. Shortly after the Memphis lynching, she wrote an editorial in the Free Speech, that's the name of the paper, which nearly caused her own lynching. Quote, nobody in this section believes the... Oh, I see. Okay. My words got crushed together there. Nobody in this section believes the threadbare lie that Negro men assault white women, she wrote. If Southern men are not careful, they will overreach themselves, and public sentiment will have a reaction. A conclusion will then be reached which will be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women. Doesn't that sound familiar? The statement outraged whites, causing the Memphis press to call for white men to, quote, to tie the wretch who utters these calamities to a stake at the intersection of Main and Madison Street, brand him in the forehead with a hot iron, and perform upon him a surgical operation with a pair of tailor shears, cut off his testicles, because they assumed it was a man, which happened in many lynchings. Many cases, often women and children were given preference in these lynchings. They could cut off the ears or the testicles or the genitals of the black who was lynched, and they got to keep those as souvenirs.
Oh my gosh!
So that's what they were calling for, because they were so offended by this thing. But what Ida Wells says here so well, think about this. She's like, look, we all know that so much of these are false accusations of rape, because you're using this to oppress and to justify the lynching of black men. And she says, look, you're going to overstep, you're going to overreach, and you're going to go too far, and the public will turn against you, and you're going to realize that this is not going to work out well for you. And I think that's, I hear that argument often today, and what, with the case of Kavanaugh, people say, well, was that one with 4, and then all of a sudden other people, oh, he used to, sponsor gang rape parties.
The girl went to 10 of them before she figured out that they were wrong.
Yeah, just all the things that came out. But they kept advancing them because they thought the seriousness of the charge.
And if there's enough of them.
If we just throw out enough of them, we have to believe them. Just because they're serious.
Which is kind of what happened with Bill Cosby. No, he was guilty.
Yeah. But
with the public opinion, when the first accusation or two came out, it wasn't really. There's a lot of like, well, come on, it's not. Someone's a gold digger here.
Yeah.
And then it came out, absolutely came out. All these women came out, different women came out saying this thing. Is like, oh my gosh. And because my wife and I were talking about, it's like there's some when we hit especially when we hit a
50.
couple dozen, a couple dozen, we were like, okay, there's something rotten.
Well, and plus there's evidence that these women brought to bear.
What's going to happen?
But even before that, there were so many. We were like, oh, and this, and you throw enough dirt.
Yeah,
they're hoping something
that
sticks.
becomes a strategy as opposed to the reality.
Exactly.
It's real in his case, but they see it as an advantage.
Exactly. He's going to win on appeal because, and I guarantee you, he's going to win on appeal.
Cosby will?
Cosby will, for sure.
He's in prison.
Yeah, but he's appealing. Well, he's going to win on appeal because the judge because this is the third time this case was brought to bear. Okay. But the difference was they let in some of these ancillary testimonies that really didn't have any bearing on the facts at hand, and the ancillary testimonies themselves became evidence that he was a serial predator. And it's the same way with Kavanaugh. And the thing that really bugged me about this case was
which case? Kavanaugh case?
Do you think Cosby's innocent?
Let me tell you why Cosby. I don't believe Cosby is innocent, and 90% of the black people who will listen to this believe me. Cosby stepped on when Cosby starts talking about black people living up to their issues and circumstances. For a lot of black people, that is just absolutely unacceptable, and that's when the tide turned against Cosby. That's when he became persona non grata. That's when all these cases that couldn't get in front of that judges had in front of them and wouldn't hear, all of a sudden then they became, he's a sexual predator. I just think it's nonsense. I don't know. I mean, I shouldn't say. I just think it's a coincidence that all of a sudden.
So you're saying that there's a political motivation for hearing the cases that wasn't there.
That wasn't there before.
True or not is still based off what the merits are. But the reason it was not heard versus became heard was because of that's what I'm hearing.
That's exactly right. And the same thing with Kavanaugh. I mean, with Kavanaugh, the thing that is the most absurd is that gal Kamala Harris. Somebody in Oceanside, supposedly in Oceanside, some anonymous person had a charge, the 5th charge, wrote in an anonymous letter saying that Kavanaugh raped me and Mark Judge raped me. Didn't leave a name, didn't leave a phone number, no address, no email, no anything. She calls him on the phone and makes him give a deposition to every step that was named into this. In this case, did you insert your fingers? Did you do this? She makes him deny every single. And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, the only reason why you do that is to intimidate the other person.
Yeah, it was about him dropping out.
They wanted him to drop out.
And that's what used to happen back in the 80s and 90s with these things. Just a charge would come out and somebody would just walk away because they didn't want to ruin their life by it.
Right, and that's why they're so angry that the Republicans, unlike in the past, decided to say, we're going to stick with the guy. Yeah. And again, we, when I say we, I mean Christians. Other people can do what they want. We have to be wary of substituting our own sensibilities for someone else's. If a guy says that he didn't do it, we should ask for evidence either for or against. If evidence comes in for and evidence comes in against, unless we know for certain we don't, or the evidence is itself unable to be corroborated, we can't convict people. Yeah. We simply, no matter how much we might want to, no matter how much we might hurt, or how much we might want to see our situation adjudicated in this man's life, we can't do that to people. We have to stand before God one day and talk about why we did what we did to these people. I'm just saying we can't do that, regardless. Of how we feel. It has to be this standard of, is there evidence? Is there evidence that he did what they claim? And by all intent and purposes, is he said, she, no, it's actually not even he said, she said, is she said, they said. They said, no, we don't know the guy. No, there was no party. So, I don't know what you expect, people to do. What do you want us to do? Just convict him on her word alone? No, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. And this stuff we read is why.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Just another example of why.
It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah. There's a lot more, but you're referring to, going back in our history in the United States and when clearly injustice was done.
If Bill Cosby was Keith Ellison, he would still be walking free today.
Oh, I don't know.
If he was Keith Ellison, he would still. If he was a liberal, they wouldn't have even brought it to trial.
Do you remember the former mayor here of San Diego, the last one that got ousted?
Oh
for sexual assault charges? I'm drawing a blank on his name.
I know what you're talking about.
Before our current mayor, anyway, we were all looking it up or something. But the last mayor here of San Diego was a Democrat, and it was known for decades that he was Filner.
Filner. That's right.
Bob Filner. There was actually, you've been Filner. It was common parlance. Matter of fact, in the last election,
term based on his name,
yeah,
like a Corinth.
He would come around and put them in headlocks and do these things to them all the time. He had assaulted stewardesses, or what do we call them now? I can't remember. Airline attendants. I can't remember. I'm sorry, wrong terms. I don't remember. But,
it's airline attendants.
But in the last election, his opponent was going to use this against them, but it was so politically onerous to even know what everyone acknowledged was true. People knew, Democrats knew. They didn't care because he was advancing their cause. So even after, the first woman that finally came out, after he got reelected anyway, she was a Democrat. She was in the military, like a colonel, I think, or some such thing. And she's like, look, she was a high level there. It wasn't a political hit. She was a Democrat supporter. She's like, he did all these things. He basically was doing things like there was a nurse for an injured warrior person, a wounded warrior that came in and said, hey, I'll get the money for your wounded warrior if you have sex with me. And he was like trying to use his position of power to do all kinds of things to women. All this came out and more and more, and then started more and more. But all the Democrats in California rallied around Filner.
They circled
the wagon. No, it doesn't matter. These are just charges. We need to give him due process. And I remember that clearly. Due process. He hasn't been convicted of anything. And they had one of the groups down here, and it was a Hispanic immigrants, Mexico immigrants group, rights group, that they had on the radio. I remember hearing this one day driving in to work. And the guys down there, the spokesman, he said, we don't care if he did this or not. He's always been good to us. Mm-hmm. He's always supported our cause, and we're going to stand up with him. That's exactly what they said.
As long as I get what I want, I don't care what
He's
happens
always
to
gotten the
somebody
money
else.
for our cause. We don't even care if it's true. And besides, he hasn't been convicted of anything yet anyway. And that was the reality of what the case is. So This is why this matters. This is why standing up for Kavanaugh's due process matters.
Mm-hmm.
Because it applies to everyone
Because
else.
it applies to everyone in every circumstance, whether it's
Otherwise,
Democrat.
you become outside the law, not even just above the law. It's like, well, allegedly some politicians who are above law. Kavanaugh becomes outside the law. The law no longer applies to him.
Yeah.
And now we can prosecute him.
We can do
That's the
we can do
power of
whatever we want
law.
to.
Not passing more regulation or rules that
Right.
control our actions, but to let the law discern between their actions when they happen to make sure that each side has a fair opportunity to be heard and not oppressed by another. That's what the law gives us the power to do. So believing Kavanaugh is innocent until proven guilty matters because I want to believe that in the South, whenever blacks were being lynched, they should have been innocent until proven guilty, not lynched because they're proven black.
Exactly. Right.
That even though as white women make an accusation, they lie. And so you can if you can't transport your argument into another demographic situation, it's a bad argument.
That's true.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's what we have to remember for people.
What's really interesting about this is
Get the seat, it's coming apart, man.
I'll put it down.
Yeah.
This is
I can't have anything nice.
To tell you how far this
This
goes
is why you
back.
can't have nice things.
This
nice
goes.
things, Joe.
You can't have nice
Wasn't
things.
wasn't this Plato's argument in the Republic that righteousness is not the majority?
Righteousness? You mean justice?
No, righteousness.
Oh, yeah.
Because remember, the majority declared whatever, because we're in power.
Yeah.
Whatever we do is righteous.
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
righteousness was whatever I do to keep me in power
And to take care of my friends.
Injustice, or what is not righteous, is allowing me to lose something to you.
Right.
And Plato was really not pleased with that
Right.
So
definition of
Yeah,
righteousness.
So Plato came up with the rule of law. That's where we get the whole term from, the rule of law. The rule of law protects the rights of not only those in power, but those out of power. And that's the point. Right now, we're saying that the rule of law needs to protect both parties. If you have corroborating evidence that a person committed a crime, then he should go to jail.
Yeah.
I mean, he shouldn't be a Supreme Court justice. But if you don't have any evidence, I'm sorry.
It's prior to Plato was might makes right.
That's right.
It was the Aristotelian sort of Greek way of doing things, and he's like, that's not good, and that's what we're going back to. I mean, I've called it many times neo-Marxism, but it's really old Greek pre-Plato views on justice.
There's nothing new
Being
under the
what's
sun.
good for me is justice. What's good for me is right. What's bad for me is injustice. That's exactly how they viewed it. And we're going full circle, so it's not new, and we're dangerous. So hopefully people get that. We're out of time. Hopefully we read a little bit more sometimes than we normally do here, but I thought they were all helpful to have this discussion.
Absolutely.
Close us out, make an announcement, and I'll get us shut down over here.
All right.
This week when we start.
We'll be here next week, Wednesday, 2:00.
Same bad time.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. Appreciate it. God bless.